There we go. Unmuting. There we go. Thank you very much, Jill, and thank you, Ashley, and everyone at Hawks. I appreciate the opportunity. Let me share my screen so I can start the presentation. Alrighty. Okay, so I've entitled this Inclusive Instruction, LGBTQIA plus and beyond. You'll note it's LGBTQIA plus and beyond. However, as with anything having to do with inclusion and diversity, a lot of these tips and policy suggestions aren't specific to LGBTQIA plus individuals. They apply across the board. So it's not a SafeZone Ally training or specific to LGBTQIA plus individuals. It's more generic. So if you do want information on LGBTQIA plus resources, those will be at the end, and we'll go over that when we go over an outline of the content. First, a little more information about me, because I'm my favorite topic to discuss. I am in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. I work at Oklahoma City Community College. I'm not a native Oklahoman. That's a big thing here. I don't know if you have that where you all are joining us in from, but it's a real big thing in Oklahoma if you're a native Oklahoman or not. I'm kind of a reverse Okie. My family's from the area originally, but we moved and transplanted to California, but we came back, so that should count for something. I grew up in Oklahoma City after moving back from California, and when I was about 15, I became homeless. Not because of my sexuality, because I do identify as a gay male, but because of other unrelated issues. As a result of that, I started a nonprofit when I was younger with a friend of mine, in concert with others, for homeless youth, targeting specifically youth that were homeless because they were LGBTQIA plus. It didn't start out that way, but we found out when we started the work that 50% approximately of the youth in Oklahoma who are homeless because they come out because they're under the umbrella of LGBTQIA plus, and they end up, because they do that, on the streets. So all of this experience forms my pedagogy and my instruction, and also is how I started getting involved with doing trainings, both as a member of the Project Safe Zone team at the University of Central Oklahoma, where I started out, and with other programs throughout the city, involved with and not involved with higher education. So that's a little bit about me and how I got involved in this work about 20 years ago now. So yes, I did get started when I was about 10. Just kidding. So before we get started, a little information about a ground rule that I have. And I know this is a super awesome image, right? It's got a unicorn and a sloth. Doesn't get much better than that. Some of you may be familiar with the golden rule. I would assume most of us are. It's something embedded in our culture and in nearly every culture. Sam Kellerman, in his text, A Guide to Gender, traces it back thousands of years and tracks its influence on nearly every faith and culture. But for our purposes, we aren't going to use the golden rule today. We're going to use, as Sam Kellerman suggests, the platinum rule. It may appear similar with a very slight and simplistic difference, but that difference is drastic in its implications due to what Kellerman refers to as the corruption of the golden rule. In his example to support this, he presents a parable of sorts in the form of an overheard conversation. To summarize the gist of the exchange is this: Kelly is upset with Pat over a comment on Facebook. Pat responds to Kelly by stating, "I didn't realize it would make you upset. That kind of thing never upsets me. It was a joke. Why are you so sensitive? You can see here that the problem with this situation, right, is that Pat takes all the responsibility for making this comment and puts it onto Kelly, right? It's not Pat's problem for making this comment that was insensitive or hurtful, right? It's Kelly's problem for being too sensitive, right? And that's what the root of this corruption of the golden rule is, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, if I'm not offended by it, then I can get away with doing it because it wouldn't offend me. So I can do it to others. That's why we're going to use the platinum rule. Right? Do unto others as they would have done unto them. The platinum rule is a simple way to avoid this corruption. As platinum is worth 3 times that of gold by weight, so this rule is invaluable in establishing an environment of respect and equity. Originally coined by Milton Bennett in the 70s, this idea is not new. Many ask how one treats people, how they would like to be treated. The answer is simple. You ask, right? When it comes to classroom operations, this may take the form of establishing shared objectives or expectations if you have that freedom, or it may be as simple as having a conversation about what you expect from your students and what they expect from you, and making those expectations realistic. And a lot of times the root of problems in classrooms come from either student or instructor expectations that aren't realistic, but more on that later. For our purposes today, it will take the form of your feedback on our content. So here's a little outline of the contents of the presentation as I see them and as I plan them. But I'm open to your suggestions and your feedback. We've already covered the ground rule, but I have planned on presenting a little bit on equality, equity, and justice. 3 words that a lot of people use interchangeably, but have very different meanings, and that's important. Tips, practices, and policy, some resources, and then having a wrap up with Q&A. Now, I know that a lot of the times when presentations like this are given, a lot of instructors really want to focus on tips, practices, and policy, things they can actually use in the classroom. So I've dedicated a lot of time to that specific part and just touch briefly on the others. However, I'm open and I want to hear from you on what you would like to spend the most time on. So please give me your opinion and feedback, and I want to take some time to hear from you. So let me know what you think. Either through the Q&A or letting me know. Chat.
It seems like a lot of them are asking for the tips, practices, and policy.
Wonderful. Well, I appreciate your feedback, and I'm glad that it aligns with mine. Sometimes in classrooms and in education, it's not quite that neat. And I was prepared to spend more time on it if you guys, you all, everyone, had other views. Also, just a little observation there. I saw the numbers going up, and that was really great. And I try really hard sometimes to let silence be there, but it's really hard because I also like to talk. That little moment was also to illustrate another tip, right, to work that part in. One of the tips that a lot of research shows is really helpful for inclusion and voicing people's voices being heard, is being comfortable with silence. Will you ask questions? How you phrase the question, saying what questions do you have for me instead of do you have any questions? And then moving on immediately, pausing and letting the silence rest, not for 2 seconds or 3 seconds, but for 15 seconds, 30 seconds, even up to a minute, and letting people speak is a great way of letting people know that their voice matters and that they're included. So that was twofold: to get your input and also to illustrate a point. So thank you for your feedback. I appreciate it. And I'm glad that the way that it's organized and the focus that we'll have on the tips, practices, and policy will be what you're most interested in. So let's move forward and get started with that. So equality, equity, and justice. A lot of you might be familiar with this image. It's really popular. You may have seen it before in one of its many iterations. It's been edited and circulated widely on the internet. This is, from all the research that I could find and that I've done, the original. It's from the All Women Initiative out of Ottawa. And it perfectly illustrates the power of words and how in a lot of instances, especially instances like what we're discussing today, they are not equally exchangeable. Right. So in the first image here, we have equality. And you'll notice that there's a barrier and that each of the individuals are given an equal assistance to adapt to the barrier. Right? But it's not helping each of them equally, right? Some people have an unfair advantage, and some people are not able to overcome the barrier with the advantage that they're given of the box, right? There are some people that have a disadvantage that they can't overcome the barrier with the box, right? In the next one, you see equity. And in equity, everyone can overcome the barrier because they're given an advantage equal to the disadvantage they originally approached the barrier with. But it's not a perfect outcome, because while they can all see, they're still problematic issues, right? There's still issues with this situation because some people have greater footing, right? The person who is firmly footed on the ground has a stabler position, right, than the person who's standing on top of two boxes and looking over the barrier, right? So equality is not as great as equity, but both are not as great as justice, which is seen in the third box, or the third image, right? Where the barrier itself has been removed. The barrier has been removed completely. The source of all adversity has been taken out of the equation, and all three can equally take part in observing the situation. Now, you will notice that none of these terms are in the title of my presentation, right? Inclusive instruction. That was on purpose. Justice does not happen overnight. Sometimes it takes decades. Other times the work is still actively taking place after more than 100 years. But we cannot be disheartened and or overwhelmed by starting with justice. It is okay to begin with inclusion, especially if that is where you have the freedom to begin. A lot of times as instructors in composition classrooms or math classrooms or science classrooms, we don't have the freedom or the resources or the power to remove all of the barriers, the systemic racism, the sexism, the homophobia, right? And if we're already overwhelmed with the burdens that we have, we don't have the resources, the time, the ability, the energy to do it all. And if we're confronted with a burden of feeling like we have to do it all, we just give up and we don't do anything. But what we can do is we can start with inclusivity, one step at a time, integrating one tip, and we can begin there and move forward. So that's why the title of this presentation is Inclusive Instruction, beginning where we can, in small bits, educating ourselves and moving forward. So tips, practices, and policy. These are a few of the different ideas and sections that we're going to touch on. Things that have worked for me, they're not the answers, the end all be all, but they are areas that I noticed students struggled with, where I've adapted and made changes, and they're areas that work for me, based in some areas on research that I did, things that didn't work and did work. And it's just over years of teaching, working with colleagues that have taught way longer and are way smarter than I am, and finding out, what worked. So late work, technology, attendance, and expectations, changing what we can, striving towards justice. So late work. And I don't usually read slides, but I know these words are small, and because I know that there's research that shows if you have words on the screen and you just read them, it negates. But just in case some people have issues reading the words, I will read some of these word for what's on there. I know you will be given the presentation so that you can read them in more detail specifically later. But there are 2 columns on each with the traditional policies that are most of us at one time or another have used, and then more equitable and less stress is what I like to infer them, because a lot of these traditional no nonsense policies were either instituted because they were either best practices or they were intended to be less stress and less work for instructors. But in my experience, they end up being more, because you end up getting more emails, more frustrated students, or more poor reviews, performance reviews, student perception of instructor effectiveness reports, things like that are poor. So traditional late work policies would appear in things like late work not accepted, just flat out stating you don't accept late work. Complicated formulas of point deductions, like for every day that it's late, I take off 10%, or 5% for every day late that compounds, or things like that. Unfair policies for individuals or favorites. If you have a student that you prefer in your class and they can turn in things late, but other people can't. Certain types of students that are allowed to turn in things late, but other students aren't. Making policies that are only for, minorities or students of a specific gender, or people that have disabilities that aren't registered with disability student services, things like that. I mean, which border on or are specifically against the law, those types of things. Stating no late work to appear harsh and then making exceptions. I know a lot of people that do this. They say, I want to come off as, being harsh at the beginning of the term, but then later on I will, be open and accepting and everything. And the problem with that is a lot of times within the first week, students will read these and see these and they will just shut down and give up. Other times, certain students with fixed mindsets or with very rigid ideas of how college is, or because of what they've heard or seen, will say, well, that's just the way it is. And even if you are, more lenient later on, they won't hear that or they won't see it. They've made their mindset. So what are more equitable ideas or less stress policies for you and for students? Beginning with resources, telling students what's available, because a lot of times those resources are not transparent on campus websites. If they're in a syllabus, they're in the back. If they're, on the campus, they're not right out front and center where students can see them. If they're in orientation training, they're confronted with 50,000 things and they don't remember. So it's just going over it and making sure that they're aware this is here for you. Frame the experience as a learning opportunity and not penalizing it initially. Just learn from this. Know in the future it will be penalized, but right now, use it as learning experience. Encouraging them to contact you and speak with you on a regular basis, making yourself accessible, giving examples and transparent guidelines, and being honest and transparent and upfront from the beginning. What's an example of this? I always tell my students the number one examples. If you have a family vacation planned and you know it's coming up, if you're getting married, if you know that your job is going to be scheduling you and you have no control over it, let me know. I know those things come up. I know a lot of the times you don't have control over that, but you know it's coming up or you know it's going to be an issue. Let me know and I will work with you. I could try to be a reasonable person. I'm a human being. Sometimes it doesn't work out that way, but I try to be a reasonable human being and I will work with you if you keep me in the loop and you make me aware. And it's amazing how if you let students know that ahead of time, it can save you time and effort and frustration. It can cut down on the unnecessary emails at the last minute, and it can make both of your lives easier. And it can help you and them in the long term with, performance reviews, with retention, with success, with persistence. Next, technology. When it comes to technology, I have one overwhelming philosophy. I love technology. I'm a tech person. I feel less and less like one as time goes by because I'm getting old. And I think that's like an aging thing. I used to think that I was like savvy, and as time goes by, I feel completely disconnected and out of the loop. But I like to think of myself still as a tech person. But I have one simple rule when it comes to my classrooms and my students, because I'm very protective, and that is technology should make my students' lives better, easier, and simpler. If it doesn't, I don't use it. If I'm required to use it for my classes, then I'm a very strict advocate of applying that rule. Examples that I use in my courses are Veed.io for processing videos and using subtitles. A lot of the times with Zoom and other softwares, subtitling is very rigid, but Veed.io is processing for videos where you can change the font, you can change the color, you can do branding, you can move the subtitles wherever you want them on the video because sometimes there's important information along the bottom and that's not a good location for them to be. So it's really, really great software. Another thing that I like to go by is I want it to be either free to my students or incorporated into what they already have. So with Veed, it's $30 a month and I pay for it out of my pocket because I can afford to. Or I try to advocate for it to be licensed to the campus, which either is incorporated into their fees or if I think it's necessary, or, like I said before, I pay for it out of my own pocket. Another thing that I use is TechSmith Snagit, which is available on campus, but I also do pay for that out of my own pocket to be able to use it everywhere. That's screen capture, video capture, panoramic screenshots. It just makes things a lot easier for me because I can do explainer videos. It's super easy. It's like 2 buttons. It's easy for me. It's easy for my students. They ask me how to do something. I just take a screenshot. I say, click here in a video. I send it to them. It's accessible. It's very easy. ETS tool and Turnitin. If your LMS has Turnitin built into it, ETS is built in to Feedback Studio and has a writing handbook built into the comments that are purple that come up in ETS. And a lot of people don't take advantage of this and don't utilize it because they say ETS is just like Microsoft Word, where sometimes it's right and sometimes it's wrong. But the handbook is important. You don't have to require another handbook for your students because that handbook is built in and provided for free. Peer mark, peer review is another tool that's built in to Turnitin Feedback Studio that's offered to your students, and it's built in. When we went to the transition due to COVID and we utilized online, I did all my peer review and workshopping of essays in person. And a lot of people transitioned to using discussion boards to do peer and self-review, and they were really frustrated with it. And a colleague of mine said, why is nobody using peer mark, peer and self-review? It's already there. And they have question banks that you can develop for peer and self-review that you can just plug in every time for peer and self-review. You don't have to create new questions every single time. You just drag and drop. It sets up deadlines for the draft, for the self-review, for the peer review, and you can go through and set that up. And it's been remarkable because you don't have the discussion board problem where some students get reviews and some people don't. It pairs them up. It does that. There are some issues and drawbacks, but it's there. And then you also can look into the amazing resources and licenses available on your campus that a lot of us aren't even aware of because we're siloed into our areas, or your state, because a lot of the times there are licensing at a state level softwares that our campuses aren't even aware of. And there are state level, like at the regents or different level software for collaboration between institutions that they just assume we know about, and we don't. So it's worth investigating and finding out what resources are there and what programs are going on that you could be a part of, because a lot of times they're just looking for people that want to be involved. Next is attendance. And this one is a big one. A lot of our students at OCCC, there's this saying that goes around, are one flat tire away from their academic career being put on hold long-term or ending. Because a lot of our students are non-traditional. Sometimes it seems like a traditional student is the thing of the past at OCCC. Because of the wide variety, the diversity of students we have very few students that are traditional in that sense. And so there are a lot of different experiences and issues coming into our classrooms on a regular basis. And we have to adapt to that. So policies that are the no nonsense ones, like automatically failing after a certain amount of absences, really don't work. And I worked in an institution before that said after the third absence in a 16-week class, you automatically receive an F. And I really had issues with that policy because it seemed to me like it only served to benefit faculty members who didn't enjoy teaching and desired to have no students in their classes halfway through the term and still get paid. Direct connection to point deductions is another one of those policies where, you know, after your first absence or the third absence, you get 10 points off your grade overall. You just penalize people for absences, period, that I've seen that people do. Complicated codes for attendance. I've seen some classes where they've had up to 12 codes for attendance: present, absent, excused, what was another one? Tardy, left early, tardy and left early, left the room without permission, like they're in middle school still. I mean, it was like this long, the list of codes with different percentages of attendance for that day that could add up to an absence. And all adding up to, you know, failure for the class. And the exact opposite, which is just a free for all, no attendance. It doesn't matter if you come, you know, I'm not arguing for that. But there are more equitable and less stress policies for attendance. And one that I go with is discussing frankly with them that those who attend and participate generally pass and those who do not, don't. If you show up to this class and you participate and engage in the class, you will pass, because I will work with you to ensure that you do. But it's not just me. Um, I tell all my students, I used to say that I'm your biggest cheerleader and advocate, but I don't believe that anymore. Because if you're not your biggest cheerleader and advocate, there's nothing I can do. And that might seem cliche, but it's true. I connect attendance to real life. I say, if you get a job and you don't show up, they'll find someone who will. And that might seem like tough sometimes, but it's true. I mean, they think they're in the real world, and sometimes you have to connect it to the real world. I always encourage them to contact me and to speak with me. If you are going through something and it's not an emergency, let me know. And beforehand, if it is an emergency, contact me as soon as possible, and I will work with you. If you contact me and you say, I was in a car wreck 3 weeks ago and it's an 8-week term, I'm going to say, I am so sorry, but you needed to contact me as soon as possible. If halfway through an 8-week term, there's very little I can do with you. I mean, it's just a grade. Withdraw. Comp 1 will always be here. I can walk you through that process. There are a lot of options available to you. Let me call, advising with you, and we can walk you through those types of things. Be human and expect the same from them. And that's going to be a thing that I repeat, because it is the best approach. There are a lot of different ways of approaching academics and philosophies and everything. And the one that I've found that works the best for me in my experience is being real and being human, treating them like human beings, period, deserving of respect, no matter what their background is, level of diversity, background. That's what students respond to in my experience. So this is another one, and this is, again, small words, and I'm not going to read all of them, but this is something I include in my syllabus. And students usually get a kick out of this because it's expectations. And I do say that this is open for discussion. I start off with what students can expect from me. In my institution, the first day that I was hired and came in for convocation, our president said, if you don't like our customer service orientation towards students, you should find somewhere else to work. And I was fine with that, because I've always had that view. If it wasn't for students, I wouldn't have a job. And I like the fact that where I work, we don't have tenure, and our performance is solely based on how successful our students are, our evaluations, and our performance, which is based on pass rates and success and persistence. So I'm real with my students, and I have expectations that are high of myself and of them. I always point out to them that on what they can expect from me, there are more, just one more, but there are more. And then what I expect from them is a mirror and a parallel. So specific to this discussion with the LGBTQIA, the first and foremost is that I will learn their preferred name and refer to them by it. That does not have to be what's in the system. If they prefer to go by something else, I will learn it and I will refer to them by it. For students from international students and from diverse backgrounds, if they tell me that something that's drastically different or seems Americanized, I do include in my introduction that if they have something that they choose to go by because they fear that people are unable to pronounce their name, that I have a lot of experience and that I will say their name correctly. And what if I make a mistake, to correct me, and I will say it correctly, because they are valuable individuals and they deserve to have their name said correctly, and they should not be forced to take on a name that's not their name. Same as individuals who are transitioning. They should not be called by their dead name because somebody thinks it's their vendetta to prove to them that they are not legitimate. Similar to that, their time is valuable. Sometimes they have family members, jobs, school, and other issues going on. Their time is just as valuable as mine. So I will be on time for office hours and for appointments. I will return their papers to them as quickly as possible. And here it says generally within a week. That's for major essays. And that was during the 16-week term semester before we transitioned to 8-week, to provide feedback on papers that explains their grade and that offers suggestions for improvement. Our comp courses are feedback heavy. Every single assignment that I require them to submit receives feedback. Every discussion board post, every response, every thing that they post receives feedback from my courses. To show respect through all communications, to pay attention to what you've said, and to let you know through question or comment that I've heard you is very important. And just basically that theme of respect through both my expectations from them and what I expect, what they can expect from me and what I expect from them, and to make myself as available to them as a resource for our course as much as possible. I do give my students my cell phone number, and I've never had an issue with students abusing that. That's a personal preference, it's not required of me. But it does help because instead of having to respond to 100 emails, I can usually just text a student back real quick and not have to receive, 13 emails because they're freaking out because I didn't respond to an email really quick. Nobody's abused that. I haven't received spam. I haven't received, text because I set boundaries. After this time, it's my time to be with my family, and they don't cross those boundaries. And a lot of the times, the only thing I get is a lot of students thanking me for being the only professor that actually responds to them when they have questions. And yes, a lot of times that's probably flattery because they have a request they're about to make, but you take it with a grain of salt. So that's expectations. Another thing that I added in here are some of the positives of open educational resources, because that's a change that we recently made at our institution as well. And I know we have time for questions, and so I'll just go through this really quick because this is something recent that we did that has importance for this specific topic. We just recently added 2 Creative Commons licensed open educational resources, and they're here for you in the resources. One of the biggest impacts that this had is that it was Creative Commons licensed, so we could change everything about the text. We could input readings from diverse authors if we would like. We could go through and change pronouns and the way they're referred to in the text, update outdated language. We went through tons of text that already existed, so we didn't have to start from scratch to develop our own. And they have access to it from day one. They don't have to pay for a single thing. It's a PDF that's in our learning management system. It's quality content. It's not perfect. There are drawbacks. Some students prefer having a print text, and if they do, they are responsible for printing it. But there are integrated assignments, and it is available and growing constantly. We do have a statewide platform that's being established in Oklahoma so that all institutions of higher ed can collaborate together and develop OER text, which is a really exciting opportunity. So that's another resource that's added in there for these things. And I know I'm going through these really quickly, but there's a lot. And you'll know a lot of this isn't specifically tailored, like I said before, to LGBTQIA+ students. But as an individual who is a member of the community, I will say one important observation is you can't speak as one person to what works or how to approach or how to represent an entire community as an individual, because they're individuals. You can educate yourselves on the vocabulary, on the topics, on the discussions, because it's not any one person's responsibility to educate you. But pandering is not the answer, for lack of a better, more eloquent way of putting it. Um, Making everything gay, making everything lesbian, making everything, one way or the other, is not the way to do it, because as it comes down to it, good inclusive pedagogy is good inclusive pedagogy. That's why the subtitle of this is LGBTQIA plus and beyond, because it does go beyond. The difference is the title of this presentation included LGBTQIA plus, when a lot of inclusive topics do not. They say inclusive, and then they focus solely on race or gender, but they don't include this element. So for resources on more information, because then I said, this isn't a SafeZone Ally training. There are great resources that do go in depth about defining LGBTQI plus terminology, and some are free and some are pay what you can, which means that they're on the open marketplace and you can get them for as little as $0, or you can pay what you can afford to support the authors. Some are free, and then again, the Chronicle of Higher Ed is an amazing resource where you can find free articles, or you can support them. It's expensive, it's very pricey, but it's worth it because they have wonderful articles there as well. So I went a little over what I meant to go over, but I want to say thank you, because I add this slide to all of my presentations because I think it's adorable, and end with my contact information so that you may email me with any other questions you have. But I know we have 15 minutes, but I don't know what anybody else has planned, but if you don't mind, I can go over because I have some time. Jill, and Ashley, so I'll stop sharing. We can go to questions.
Hi, yes, thank you so much. That was great. We do have a few questions in here that we can go over. The first one, which we just wanted to confirm, will the slides be available after the presentation? Are you planning on sharing them again?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I didn't have power for 2 weeks because of an ice storm that we had, and the tree fell in our house, and I was living out of a motel, and so I was really pressed to put this all together, and I let everybody know that, but I will be sending an email as soon as we're done here.
Perfect. And another question, can you have a more equitable late work policy while still enforcing some sort of grade penalty? If so, what would be a fair penalty?
With my classes, there's always a balance, and it works by experimentation. Like I said, my policies are specifically tailored to the environment that I work in. And you're the ones that are experts in where you're teaching and the environment that you're working in. You're the ones that know what works for these students in the environments that you're teaching in. So if you know the motivation that will best influence your students and best motivate them and not prohibit them from, working. The thing that I find the most problematic is when somebody says, this is the right way to do it, and it will work across the board for everyone, because that's never going to work. It's never going to be something that applies. My husband is a teacher at a university almost exactly on the other side of the city from me, and it's a 4-year institution. And we talk about this all the time. He does things that are completely different from what I do, and he's worked even longer in English, and as instructor, he's an advisor of the LGBT group there, and I'm the advisor of the LGBT group at OCCC. And we do things sometimes that are totally different, but they work for where we are. He has no policies about late work whatsoever. I joke with him all the time that he's just a big pushover, but also he's tenured. He's the chair of the Department of English there, and he only teaches 1 to 2 classes a term. So if he just accepts papers whenever for everyone, it's different than me, where I teach 5 classes a term, I am on multiple committees, and I work 16 hours a day. And if I accept a paper too late, that is overwhelming and affects my mental health in a certain way. So usually what I tell students is the first time, there's no penalty. It's a learning experience. In the future, it will affect your grade slightly. But after that, it will not be accepted at all, that kind of thing. But I also put in my syllabus that it's a case-by-case basis, that I reserve the right to speak with you and to understand through this conversation and dialogue what the reasoning behind it is. If the reasoning behind it is that you just didn't do it, that there was no justification, that you just didn't do it, and that you have no motivation, and there's no explanation, then we're just going to say, who do you need to talk to about finding a motivation? What resources do you need for time management? Why are you here? There's advising and counseling for that. What resources do we need? That kind of thing. That gets really deep. I could talk for an hour about that, but does that answer your question at all? You're muted, I think, Jill.
Along with that, sorry, the next question was about late work for a compressed, 8-week courses and writing courses where one piece is part of the next assignment and it's not really feasible for the students to turn in work late and get the needed feedback for the next assignment. I have suggestions on that.
Sorry, I muted myself because I don't want to cough on everybody. Digitally cough on everybody. Every single thing that we do, we just did a transition. In the earlier talk, I talked about this, the being overloaded thing. We transitioned to OER, 8-week terms, redesigning all of our comp courses, and like 2 other things at the same time COVID happened, all at once. And when we did that, part of the redesign was every single thing we kept for comp 1 and comp 2 is leading and building up to the next thing. So every single thing desires feedback and gets feedback, and every single thing builds on what comes next. So it is that way. Every single thing is necessary, has to have feedback. You can't submit it that much later in an 8-week term. And so I tell them, we're constricted by time. It's not me being unreasonable. It's not me, doing this. But if you come and speak with me, in class or after class, or now that we're not meeting in person at all, in Zoom, I make myself available so that I can try to facilitate what that is, that you missed, so that you're caught up. You're not going to make the grade because that time has passed at this point in the term. Again, we have that learn from it and not be penalized. And then that, maybe if there's justification, deduction in time. But at this point in the term, it's just like, you can't make the grade, but come meet with me and I'll make sure that I can bring you back up to speed so that you can make up what you missed content-wise. Does that make sense? So you might have missed the feedback and you might have missed that, but you can at least get the experience if you want. A lot of times though, if they are that checked out, they won't take you up on it. And there's little you can do if they're not going to engage and participate. That's not giving you a free pass, but you can't go to their home and force them to engage. You can only do so much. And at that point, you have to give yourself grace. You've done what you can.
And then another one, as a writing and composition teacher myself, I've noticed that I struggle with issues of inclusion on account of a diversity of background knowledge that my students possess or don't possess when they join my class. This often causes me to feel that many of them are behind and have not had as complete of an exposure to certain skills or concept as the other students. Do you have any advice on how to make curriculum more inclusive in these cases?
It's hard. it's really hard because we find ourselves a lot of the times being a catch-all, you know, for I struggle with this all the time because I'm teaching, I have a full plate teaching students just how to write, because you think, you know, I have this checklist of objectives for writing composition that I would have a full plate with just in its own. But then I also have to touch on mindset to help them realize that they can improve on their skills and their knowledge, that they're not just a fixed, you know, state, that they can improve. and and then you have to go into that, and then you have to talk about, you know, um, the difference between getting a piece of paper and developing critical thinking and analysis skills, and how when you graduate with a degree, you are on the level playing field as everybody else who had that piece of paper. And what's going to put you above them is if you can think on your feet critically and analytically, if you can interact with human beings from different various backgrounds. It's that real world application, right? You're going to interact with people from different backgrounds. If you can do so, if you can not see eye to eye, not agree with everybody, but if you can cooperate as a team, if you can, you know, work together with people that you disagree with. You know, I always say this: we're going to work together. We're going to do things. You don't have to agree with everybody, but you do have to be respectful of everyone. You don't have to understand everyone. You're never going to understand me. I'm a weirdo. Like, I don't make sense to anybody. My husband doesn't understand me half the time, and he married me. Like, that proves everything, right? So, I mean, you just have to try to do what you can. I mean, none of us are ever going to uh, be perfect at what we do, and it's a constant struggle to try to do as the best we can. Real life application, I constantly try to include as many voices as possible in my courses, as diverse as possible. We have what we call mentor text in our course. We do a narrative text for an essay, we do an informative text, and we do a classical argument for Comp 1. I don't know why. It's not my perfect idea of what we would do in Comp 1, but for each of those, we have example mentor texts that they read, at least one. And I use different texts, but I always try to have at least, for each of those, a person of color, a queer identifying individual, um, and a lot of times, if it's a text and you address that that person is a member of these communities, a lot of times those individuals don't even know that people they've read before, or maybe they haven't read them, were members of those communities. And more, there's evidence that people they have read before were members of those communities. And making those connections to people that they are familiar with, or people that they aren't familiar with, or maybe have heard a little bit about, were members of those communities, or are, or learning more, like these people are normal, you know, are individuals, are human beings. Even me as an instructor, being transparent with my students that I am a member of these communities, and I'm not the stereotype that they think of when they see it. I'm a person of faith. I am a friend, a family member, those types of things. Does that as well. And having people from the community, from the faculty, from the campus come in and speak can be helpful as well.
And then along with that, where does racial diversity come into your teaching and other ideas?
It's all integrated. Like I said, I don't separate anything out, because the one thing that I find frustrating is that people try to act like any of these things are sectioned off. We are all in this together. It's all intersectional. One of the most frustrating things that I found when I started fighting for rights for homeless youth, for rights for women, for rights for all of my family members of color, was that people were scattered and fighting for their thing. And anytime somebody else wanted to, you know, come together or to do something, they're like, that's going to pull away from my thing. And I was like, it's all intersectional. When one of us is hurting, we're all hurting. And so I tie all of it together. You can't be somebody who's a social justice person that's a racist, that supports racism, and stands by and lets somebody subject somebody to racism. And so, like I said, you can find and support people of color that are LGBTQIA plus. That I every single time somebody brings something up at OCCC where it's issues of racism and sexism and stuff like that, I say, I don't witness discrimination at OCCC because I'm gay, but that's also because I'm a very privileged person because I am male, I am white, right? I might be gay, but I'm a gay white male. And there are people at our institution that are Black, female, queer, trans people. There are people that are non-binary, people of color. So while they're being discriminated against, we're all suffering. So that's something to fight for. But it's integrated into my thing because, it's a faith thing. It's a institutional thing. It's a comp thing. Race, sexuality, and gender was the focus of my composition and rhetoric study, and it's all intersectional. So
okay, we have probably time for just one more, and then we'll wrap it up. Do you have any good icebreaker tools or games that are effective for the first day of class that creates a welcoming environment for the LGBTQIA plus students? I do this for all students, but sometimes they're still reluctant to speak freely.
Oh my gosh. Oh, that's so hard. Because I'm an introvert. You probably wouldn't think that because when I'm teaching, it's totally different. I don't know how to explain it because I recharge by teaching, but I'm a total introvert. And so when it comes to like icebreakers, I loathe them with the fire of 1,000 suns. But when it comes to teaching in icebreakers, like I usually do attendance, and it's more of like a valuing their baggage, but also knowing that classroom is a time to focus on what we're coming together to support and do. That's like commonality, and we're all human beings. We have this common value and belief and thing that we do. And so there are so many books that are like 4,000 icebreakers or 4,000 conversation starters, and we have like the first few minutes. How I do attendance is I have like a question of the day, and we discuss it. And so I don't do like a sign-in sheet or anything like that. I have on the board, I always have a schedule for the day. I come to class a few minutes early, and on the whiteboard, I put like the schedule of the day. And the first thing is, I always have the date in MLA because that's like the number one thing. It's always put the date in MLA at the top of the board. And then the first thing is the question of the day. And so they can think about it if they get there early in the first few seconds of the day, they can see the question of the day, and then, the rest of the schedule. And so when I call attendance and I call their name, they don't say here or present, they share, what their response to the question of the day is. And that way it's attendance. So if you want credit for being there that day, you answer. And we all get to learn something about each other throughout the term. And so no matter what, people know each other and they know something about each other as we go throughout the term. And it fosters conversations because they oh yeah, you're the person that likes that, and I like that too. So I really like that. It's something that a colleague of mine was like, hey, yeah, it gets them to not think about all the stuff they're having to deal with throughout the day. It gets them thinking about class and, you know, talking to each other and everything. So, and you can make it about anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be LGBTQIA specific, but you can make it general too. It doesn't have to be binary, you know, your significant other instead of your spouse or your boyfriend or girlfriend, you know, that kind of thing. Being aware of things being termed in an open way instead of a binary way. And I'm not perfect. Like earlier, I said guys instead of everyone. I'm still learning. Everybody slips up, but you know, there's always room for improvement. But that's one that worked really well for me. I like that one a lot.
Yeah,
I
that
miss
sounds
it.
like a really good idea. But it seems like we are just about out of time, or ran over a little bit. But thank you so much, Professor Horne, and thank you for all that I did today. If you have any questions, you can direct them right to us at marketing@hawkslearning.com, and we'll be emailing you a link to view this webinar on demand. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. I know we didn't get to answer all the questions, but we will do our best to reach out to you if we didn't get to them. But thank you so much.